So a while ago, I was horsing around in Elden Ring and I decided to make my own character avatar into my own style using Blender. So I started with a rough sketch in Krita and basically tried to outline the proportions and the stylistic approach of the project. And with that done, I used it as a reference to make a low poly model of my character avatar. And I used a katana that I made for a previous project and basically refactored it for this one. Unfortunately, I didn't record the modeling process, but you'll see me poly modeling in a future section of this video, so stay tuned. I'm basically gonna refactor the old katana into the Moonwell katana that my character uses, which is a bit longer and has a different sort of handle. I'm also gonna elongate the sheath and I'm gonna start the UV unwrapping. At first, I thought I was going to unwrap everything traditionally, but then I realized it would take way too much time and the project didn't really require perfect UV maps since it's not made for a game. So I basically decided to use all of the seams that I set up, but also use the Smart UV project to unwrap the model. And after that, I started with the texture painting. I was sticking very close to the reference, setting up a color palette and using those colors to paint the textures. And I also planned on turning the diffuse texture, which is what you see me painting right here, and turn it into a black and white image and basically feed it into the height of the bump node to turn that data into normal data, which would reflect in the lighting, no pun intended. So here I realized that I had X symmetry on, and painting this rope belt is basically gonna be pretty tough because it's not symmetrical at all. So I had to get around all that by hiding the meshes that aren't symmetrical, things like the shoulder pad on his left arm and the sheath and the belt itself. So here I'm painting the shin guards, which are made out of bamboo, and I'm leaning a lot on the texture to convey that information. And since I'm gonna be turning the diffuse map into the bump map, I think it would work out pretty well. So I took my time painting all the little small details. So I'm also using a black and white texture as a mask for the metallicness and roughness of the shader, and I could probably have simplified this process if I used an add-on called UQ Paint. I would probably try it out in a future project for sure, since it basically gives you a layer based approach instead of just manually creating image textures and setting up an image texture for every little thing that I do. For example, the roughness and metallic and whatnot. There's tutorials out there for it, so I'll definitely check it out in the future. So here I'm setting up the lighting for the background, and I took a little bit of reference from the actual lighting in Limgrave, since that's the area I'm kinda gonna try to portray in the final animation. Now I'm painting all the details on the helmet. This process may look a bit tedious, but it was actually pretty fun and pretty rewarding. I also noticed that the helmet is not a one-to-one from the actual in-game helmet, but I wasn't trying to make 100% accurate representation of the in-game model, so it wasn't a big deal. So at first I wasn't really feeling great about the way the helmet looked, but the moment I started to paint in the metallic mask, it really started to look good. As I was getting closer to completing the character model, I started to set up the lighting for a quick model turnaround. I then also added some procedurally generated noise to the metallic and roughness texture to add a bit more detail. Also, I didn't mention this before, but I used TinyNoki's Tiny Eye add-on. It's a free add-on by TinyNoki, and it features a highly customizable eye asset that you can use for your own models. I do recommend checking it out, so the link is in the description. I tried to add a depth of field effect to the camera, but I couldn't really get it to look exactly the way I wanted to, so I ended up not including it. Painting the textures for the katana was a bit weird because the orientation of the katana was not at the world origin, so it was not possible to turn on symmetry and paint the textures on both sides. So I had to manually paint in those circles one by one on both sides of the katana, which to be fair wasn't that bad and it looked pretty good, but there obviously would have been a better way to do it. So I studied the Japanese woodblock prints of the 18th century to kind of see how artists used to depict katanas in a more simplified way, since this was a stylized project. So I kind of implemented the how the handles are made from those paintings, which was pretty cool. Here you see me doing the other side of the katana, making all those circles one by one. And with that, the character model is pretty much complete, and here's the result. But wait, I forgot one thing, which is the Carian royal scepter that my character wields. So I immediately got into modeling that. It is a kind of an interesting design because the whole thing goes in a spiral kind of a pattern, including the handle, which houses a glintstone, which is a cool design. And fortunately, I did record the modeling process for this, unlike the character model itself. So I UV unwrapped it, set up some image textures, and this time I'm not going to convert the diffuse into the bump map since bump map, but I'm gonna actually paint in those textures separately since a lot of the details are gonna be pretty different. And I just use a noise texture for the roughness, keeping it pretty simple. I was pretty happy with the results of this. So for the glintstone inside the scepter, I used a Fresnel shader to make it look like it was glowing, and I also added a water noir texture to make it look like an actual crystal. And with that out of the way, I could now start modeling Torrent, our trusty steed, or goat, or I don't know what Torrent is, but he's pretty chill. I also, while making this video, just realized that Torrent is basically Dark Souls Yakul from Princess Mononoke, which is my favorite movie of all time. Period. Since I'm not gonna animate the face of Torrent, I'm not really concerned about the loop directions and whatnot, and I'm just doing a really casual job at polymodeling. Now I'm extruding out the horns, and at first I thought I would use a curve to make the horns, but Just extruding them and rotating each extrusion one by one also worked. Moving on to the torso, then to each individual limb on one side, of course, because the model is mirrored. This is where the 2D reference that I made came in pretty handy, because if at this point in the modeling process I didn't have the proportions decided on previously, it would have been a really rough time. Now I'm using a UV sphere for the eyes and adding a mirror modifier. To make the saddle, I just duplicated a few faces from the torso, scaled them up, and changed their topology to resemble a saddle. I added the bags that Torrent carries at the back, the footrest, and the reins. Then I used a tutorial by Jason-chan. The tutorial basically tells you how to create hair cards, which is the technique that a lot of video games use to create hair that perform well in a real-time rendering situation by using curves. So I used the technique from that tutorial to create these curves that were customizable since they were procedurally generated, and I used them to create the flock of hair, and I mirrored them on both the sides. And after that I converted the curves into a mesh, which could then be UV unwrapped pretty easily and mapped to a hair texture. So for the hair texture, I opened up Krita and just made this texture in like 2 minutes, I guess. Then came back to Blender, added it to the hair shader, and started to UV unwrap Torrent's model. After the UV unwrapping was done, as you might have guessed, we now move on to texture painting Torrent. And at first I did try to use that same approach I did for the character model, where I just turned the diffuse texture into the bump information, but that didn't really work out so well. So I changed my mind and created a separate bump texture. So for the leather on the saddle and the bags, I used a Voronoi texture on the bump and a little bit on the roughness as well. And it was very easy to set up and it looked pretty good pretty fast. With the Torrent model now textured, it was time to move on to the rigging. And I was dreading this part for a long time because this was not gonna be a simple task. I used Rigify's basic horse rig and tried to use the automatic weights option, but that didn't work because of the disjointed meshes. So I had to do a lot of manual weight painting, which wasn't a big deal since it's actually supposed to be an essential part of the 3D animation workflow. So I got it to work to an acceptable level and then moved on to setting up some wiggle bones for parts of the mesh that were supposed to have secondary motion added to them. The way I do it is by extruding bones and adding a damp track with a value of 0.5 all throughout the string of bones. So that way it adds procedural secondary motion whenever the parent bone moves with the animation. For the hair, I made a proxy mesh that was parented to the wiggle bones, and the proxy mesh by intent was pretty simple, and in order to transfer the animation onto the hair mesh, I added a surface deform modifier on the hair mesh with the proxy mesh as a target. That technique is used a lot in cloth simulation, so I figured I'd try it out for adding secondary motion to the hair, and it actually turned out pretty well, but I missed a section of the hair that didn't have any proxy mesh to deform to, so it glitched out in the first attempt, but then I noticed it in the renders and fixed it later on. With Torrent's rig now fully done, Torrent can now throw that booty around.
I've been a nasty girl, nasty. I've been a nasty girl, nasty. I've been a nasty girl.
All jokes aside, it was now time to start getting the animation ready for the final render. I had a lot of fun animating the bounciness of the final render, and I also set up a particle system for the particles that appear when Torrent is summoned. I also set up the background, but I didn't record the process for that since the video would be way too long if I did that. With all that work out of the way, here's the final result. Do consider hitting the like button and the subscribe button and push the bell notifications.